How do you do, neighbor? It's Berean Spirits time once again. The boys have gathered around, and they're ready for you. So join in, make comments, and study with the guys as they try to study as the Bereans did in Acts chapter 17. And now, here's the guys.
It's that time again for another episode of Berean Spirits. My name is Chris Peltz. I'm the evangelist with the Southside Church of Christ. Joining me, as always, is Mr. the Richard Dotson in Kearney, Missouri with the Kearney Church of Christ. How is Mr. Richard today?
I like that D. That sounds good. The Richard Dodson. Yeah. No, I'm good. I'm really good.
Yeah, awesome. We've got Josh Thornhill from the Wichita area over with the West Side, Church of Christ in Wichita. How's Mr. Thornhill today?
Good. We're the North Side Church on the south side of the city.
Oh man, all these south side, north side, west side, central.
We're on the west side.
Yeah,
which is why we're
west side.
So. But I'm good.
Strong side.
Ooh, yeah. Good movie.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Man, everybody's surviving the storms. Spring has sprung, and it is that time of year for a lot of storms. And man, it was widespread. A lot of tornado activity, severe storms, hail, beating up cars and roofs. But we're here this morning. We've survived, and certainly prayers go out to those who have been affected by these storms. But I think we got a good program for you today, as we are going to be talking about why do bad things happen? Why are we going through difficulty, struggles? And ultimately, we're going to answer the question that a lot of people are asking, or maybe redirect their question a little bit and help gain a better understanding. Because the question generally people ask is, why does God allow these things to happen? Or sometimes even, why is God causing these things to happen? And ultimately, that it's easy to blame God. It's easy to, shift blame, to put into account why these things are happening to something or someone that you're not confronting yourself. You are, you don't want to either admit things concerning your own actions, others' actions, or you just really don't understand how things are working and what God is doing. And so you just simply blame God for the things that are going on in the world around you. And so we're going to address that today. And I want to start with 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, in verse 17, it talks about how the present afflictions, right, the things that are going on right now, they're here for, first of all, for a short period of time. But I think that in conjunction with the book of Romans, as Paul writes, these things, not only are they here just for a short time, but they're not even to be compared to the glory that we will have when it comes to the glory of heaven. But nevertheless, we are going through certain afflictions. There are some that are suffering more than others, by all means. But the question is why? Why are these things happening? And it's kind of a multifaceted answer. And Richard, when you go to this particular subject, this idea of why things are happening, again, a lot of people want to blame God. right? But um, there's really not necessarily a simple answer to this.
Well, you know what? I mean, if you want to jump into the a swimming pool and the water's cold, you can't be blaming anybody but yourself when you come up screaming because the water's cold. I mean, you're in cold water. And we live in this world, and this world is running down. I mean, everything is they're just things are decaying. Now, that was an order that was set by God when Adam and Eve sinned and they were cast out of the garden. And the Lord had placed certain he things changed. Man had to work by the sweat of his brow, and it wasn't going to be easy. Thorns were going to grow among his crops, meaning that there was going to be difficulties, there was going to be problems, and this was part of the order that the Lord established. And there's I think it has to do with bringing man to salvation, but there is definitely going to be suffering in this world, and Satan has a lot to do with that. But inevitably, man did it to himself, and that's how we got to this point. It's nothing that God did to man; it was man doing it to himself. And of course, the thing that people say, why does God allow it? Why does God allow suffering? That's the multifaceted answer that I believe Chris is getting at, because we're going to have to understand, in this world, suffering will take place. The rain falls on the good and the bad, but exactly why the suffering takes place, that's a multifaceted answer, and I guess we'll deal with that today.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're going to attempt to anyway, because there's a few things that people need to do. They need to examine themselves, they need to look at others, they need to look at the world around them. And they need to look at the idea of all kinds of, right, chastening, but sometimes we get so caught up and zeroed in on such a small sliver of the whole picture that we can't see the whole picture, especially with what God is doing as a whole. But ultimately, Josh, one of the things I think is important for us to understand is the idea of free will, because free will is something that God has blessed us with. Some might say he's cursed us with, but it really is a blessing. But sometimes that's where the affliction or the troubles come, right? Is from our own free will.
Right. You look at Genesis chapter 1 and 2, God created the entire world, everything in it. And when God, at the conclusion of the sixth day, when God has completed his work of creation, he looks upon this creation and he says that it is good. And
very,
each day
very good.
Very good. Yeah. Each day of creation, God looks upon what he has made and saw that it was very good. And so mankind, of course, is included in that. And yet we're not robots. I think, when we think about creation, God created man in his image with their own will and their own desires. And that's so that we could love him, because that's the only thing that makes love meaningful. It's like, there was a TV show years ago. This kid, he was wanting to study, or he's like, well, I need to study. And then it's like, well, I'm bored. And says, you know what? I'm going to get good grades and I'm going to go build a wife, when he gets older. But the problem is that probably it's a robot that I imagine he would build. It's only going to do what he programs it to do, and that's not real love. I mean, there's these stories coming around of people having these relationships with ChatGPT, that it is a romantic partner, supposedly. These people are not operating in reality because it's not real love. It can't be. It's always synthesized. It's always, synthetic. It's not real and genuine love. And the only way that God could get that from us is if he gave us free will, if he gave us the ability to choose to love him and to serve him, or to choose to reject him. And so that's what we have. And so the influence, Richard talked about Satan, the influence of Satan came into the world and corrupted. We see that in Genesis 3 with Adam and Eve, corrupted. The sin has entered the world now, and the world has become corrupted by sin. And you can see up to chapter 6 that digression continues to occur and grow further and further and further away from God. And all of that is the result, and everything that we see, all the sufferings, the difficulties, the struggles, all of that is a result of the influence of sin that has come into the world. And people want to ask the question, well, why did God knows that they're going to do bad things? Why doesn't he just stop them? Why doesn't he just stop anybody doing anything? Why doesn't he just make us robots in the first place?
Well, and
Yeah,
that right there is the important part, I think, and I'll let you continue in just a second. But if he's going to stop people's free will from doing bad things, evil things, then he has to stop the free will from allowing us, us to make good decisions and right decisions. And I think that's a part that many people miss. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. He can't just stop people from doing bad things without maintaining a complete control. And that's what the Calvinist idea is that God has a complete control over all of creation. And so if I were to punch Richard in the face, it would be because God ordained that. God made me do that. I had no choice in the matter. It's that God had predestined that I would punch Richard in the face. I mean,
well, maybe that's not such a bad idea.
I know. But anyway, the problem with such a thinking is, I just got so wrapped up in punching Richard in the face that I forget where I was going there.
You wouldn't have a choice.
Yeah, we wouldn't have a choice, and that number one, it removes the aspect of love from our sight. But also, if we take that to its logical end, and the Calvinists do not have an answer for this, and they'll admit it. If God is meticulously sovereign, as they claim, and so he's in control of every little aspect of everything that goes on in this world, then God is responsible for evil. That's the implication. That's the conclusion of such an idea. But when you see that God has created mankind, he's created them good, and he's created them with a free will, and they have sought out many schemes, Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 39 tells us, then God is not culpable when evil is committed. He is the creator, and he's given you the ability to make choices. And so God tries to direct you, and he tries to guide you, and he tries to lead you to the right choices and away from evil. But ultimately, we have to make that choice. And sadly, all of us have failed in that in one regard or another. But many have just dove headfirst into evil. And that's where we see many of the atrocities that have happened in the world around us. A lot of the suffering is a result of the evil people that are in power, that are ruling, that are doing things to oppress other people. And God is allowing people to make their choices. But one last thing before I'll pass it back. Although God does allow people to make those choices, they are not free from the consequences of those choices. You look at our government here, for instance, and how evil our government has become. They may not be thrown in prison. They may not face justice in this life, but when they die, they will go stand before God, and they will uh, be, they will receive justice. And so maybe God does allow suffering in this life. He does allow it because of the free will of mankind, but he will pay them back for their evil deeds. God will take vengeance for their ungodliness.
Yeah, Richard, this is something that again, there's lots of things that we could get into, because you think about the things that are happening. A lot of things are self-inflicted, right? A drunk who is an alcoholic who suffers from a liver disease or liver cancer. Why is God allowing? That's something he did to himself, right? A drunk gets behind the wheel of a car and drives and kills a family because he was drunk driving. It's because of his decisions, because of what he decided to do, that others are suffering for those decisions. But ultimately, right, either the decisions that we make, the decisions that others make, their will being done, ultimately God is desiring for us to look to him for help in times of need, as Hebrews chapter 4 points out, or rather than blame him and turn away from him. He's wanting us to turn to him and receive the strength to get through these afflictions.
Yeah, now, you're talking about choice. I believe that choice is really brought out in the fact when the Lord, after Adam and Eve sinned, that's when the Lord said, he says in verse 22, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And so to me, when I look at that, when it says knowing good and evil, and it says now, so he won't reach out and take of the tree of life, eat and then live forever. This life can be summed up by, what do you choose? What did Joshua charge the Israelites after, before he died? He says, choose you this day whom you will serve. And so when we're looking at that, and we look at what Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes, the whole conclusion of man, fear God and keep his commandments. It's what you choose to do. And it seems like that everything that we see that has been, we're in the swimming pool and the water's cold, and when we did it to ourselves. But like if a tornado wipes out a house, or a drunk driver, as you said, wipes out your family, and you're sitting there saying, why me, Lord? It seems like everything has been put in place to show you what sin does. And this is going to be the end result of it. And the whole challenge is to develop man to make the right choice. Try to see, first of all, and we'll talk about this because I got some scriptures, but it's going to want to show that man is prepared to be developed by God spiritually and to choose to be good rather than evil.
Well, Richard, let's go ahead and get into those scriptures, because that's what we want to do. We could sit here and talk and kind of set this up as for hours, but ultimately what we need to do is we need to look at, because the word of God is the power of God into salvation. It is that which we use so that we can discern good and evil. The word of God equips us for every good work. The word of God, is that which is leading us to God himself and hope and peace and love, as Josh talked about. So let's go ahead and get into those.
All right. Well, here's a few passages, and you guys can give some too, but these have to do with how God uses, these trials that we're speaking about to develop us spiritually. And there's different ways in which he develops us. But in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8 and 10, and I'll read this. It says, for we do not want you to be unaware, Paul said, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. So there was suffering taking place. For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. They were tired of living. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. Why? Why did God allow that? But that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. He delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us. On him again we set our hope. And it goes on. All right, so why did God allow this terrible affliction to come upon them to the point that they despaired of life itself? Why did God allow that suffering? In this particular case, he says it was to make them rely not on themselves, but on God. And, could that be a reason why we see suffering in this world? Why we see things? Isn't that God trying to teach man, hey, don't rely upon yourselves. You need to rely upon me. I think it's a very good possibility. Let's look at another one here in Romans chapter 5, starting in verse 3. Paul says, not only that, we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame. And then it goes on. But here we can see then that the sufferings in this world produces things. Not only do we learn to rely upon God, but it also teaches us endurance. It teaches us character. It produces hope. These are spiritual attributes that God wants, and he's using the suffering to be able to teach us. Now, one other thing I'll bring up, and I'll turn it back over to you, but this is something that I think a lot of Christians miss. And that is, when their health is afflicted, again, there's the why me, Lord. Why are you making me go through this? Well, Paul had some type of thorn in the flesh, and he went through the same thing. He prayed to the Lord 3 times for the Lord to remove this thorn from him. But the Lord's answer was no. Now, why would the Lord allow him to go through this type of trial? Why would he allow him to suffer like that? Well, there was a reason individually for Paul, starting in 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 7. Paul said, so to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. And all he's saying is there was so much given to Paul in his work of servicing the church, his work in serving the Lord. So much was given to him that the Lord was concerned about him losing his place, losing his humbleness. And so he had to provide something that, again, would make him rely upon God instead of looking to himself and saying, oh, look at me, look how great I am. The people think I'm great. So he gave him this thorn in the flesh, and it did harass him and it troubled him. But it also, he was able to use that to keep his mind right, to allow him to keep him faithful. And so because of that, he became very thankful for that thorn in the flesh. So many times Christians miss this. Could this be a reason that people have, different ailments in their health? Could this be the very reason? Perhaps the Lord is using this or allowing this so that you will keep your mind right. And instead of being caught up in pride and not relying upon God, you'll look to God more so that you will be able to be as you should be, a very humble and faithful servant.
Yeah. He even says in that very same text that, by grace, right? That his grace is sufficient. Not only is his grace sufficient, but God's strength is made known in our weaknesses when we rely upon him. And And that is so important for us to understand. I'm reminded of Philippians 1, verse 12, where Paul was in prison in Rome, and he's writing to the Philippians and he's in chains, and he says that these chains has served for the furtherance of the gospel. You would think, well, how can being thrown in prison, wrongfully accused, set in chains, how can that work for the furtherance of the gospel? Well, it's because Paul wasn't so reliant upon physical and the things of this world and worldly circumstances to keep him from focusing upon the grace of God, to keep him from focusing upon the strength of God. In fact, later in Philippians chapter 4, in verses 11 through 13, he talks about how he has learned to be abased. He's learned to abound, to have nothing, to go without, and to have an abundance. But in verse 13, he wraps it up and he says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And so looking upon him was the answer to those afflictions that we face. And Josh, when we're not relying upon God, right, we're unfruitful. We're looking for someone to blame. We're caught up and we're focused merely upon what this world has to offer, rather than understanding that this world is temporary and truly not our home.
Yeah, you started off with 2 Corinthians 4:17. And Paul says there in verse 16, we do not lose heart, though our outer man is perishing, though our inner man is being renewed day by day. And by the way, just some of that context is they're talking about some of the sufferings that he's enduring as an apostle of Christ, as the apostles are enduring for preaching the gospel. And he says then in verse 17, our momentary light affliction. And I think that's perspective.
Yeah.
Momentary light affliction. And I would dare say that some of the afflictions they're facing is far worse than what we're facing.
Yeah.
Our momentary light affliction is working out for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. While we look not at the things which are seen, but at things which are not seen, for the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. And then he's going to move into the 5th chapter, where he's talking about this house being torn down. And when he talks about the house, he's talking about our physical bodies, this earthly dwelling. He's saying it's going to, if it is torn down, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. And he says the reality is we'd rather be in that dwelling, honestly, because then we'd be in the presence of the Lord. Our desire is to be clothed with our immortal, our heavenly dwelling. And so he says in verse 6, being always of good courage and knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord. For we walk by faith, not by sight. We are of good courage and prefer rather to be absent from the body to be at home with the Lord. I think part of what Paul's saying there when he says in verse 7, we walk by faith and not by sight, we're willing to continue to preach the gospel, knowing that it's going to bring suffering to us, because we're looking forward to being clothed with our eternal dwelling.
Mm-hmm.
And so the point that Paul's making is you can't take that away from us. You can, like Job in the book of Job, you can have everything taken away from us, but you can't take away our hope. You can't take away what God will reward us with after this life is over. That is eternal, and that is our hope. And that's why we lean upon God as we go through these sufferings, because that's really the answer. It's all going to make the sufferings worthwhile. I remember when I was in high school, we were going to out of state to a competition, a band competition. And leading up to it, our band director had decided to have more practices than he usually had. And you're kind of like, oh man, like, we never did this before. But then we went to this out-of-state competition and we won. We got first place in the whole competition. And then you're sitting there thinking, oh, that was worth it. All that extra work that we had to put in, all that hard work, it was worth it. It has come to fruition. All the sufferings that we are enduring in this life will come to fruition and be worth it when we stand in the presence of God for eternity. And so God allows us to deal with these things because we're going to be we're going to enjoy something far greater. I was reading a book one time and it was asking the question, can you imagine how spoiled we would be if we never faced adversity? I mean, it'd be like Chiefs fans, right? You know, you know, when they were up until this last season, but you know, if we didn't face adversity, we wouldn't appreciate the good. And so we know how to appreciate good things in good time when we've gone through suffering, because we can tell the difference, and that helps us to bolster our hope in eternity, because this world is not our home.
Yeah. Yeah. James chapter 1, verse 2, count it all joy, my brethren, when you fall into various trials, knowing that the tempting of your faith produces patience. And in those trials, it's not when, or rather, it's not if, it's when, and various, right? In various ways, various struggles that we're going to have. But it can have its work in you if you will let it. And that's the problem. Too many people, we see it around us today. We definitely are in this world, this society that is just full of whiners, full of complainers, right? They're the victims of everything. And, God is, he doesn't look at that lightly by any means. He doesn't look at that and think, oh, I'm just going to pull them out of it, without them doing anything, right? He's given us his word because these are things that every generation has struggled with. Every generation has gone through various trials, afflictions, difficulties, whether it's on an entire nation, neighborhood, or individual. There has been struggles and difficulties, and God has been there, calling the people to him. And just as Hebrews chapter 12 points out, right? He chastens those of whom he loves, and he's chastening everybody. And so we need to keep that in mind as well. Receive these things as possible chastening, but understand as well, sometimes, we are affected indirectly, by the bad and poor decisions of others and the sins of others. But all of this is temporal. All of this is going to be done away with, and we will, if we are faithful to God, we'll have a home eternally in the glories of heaven where, he wipes away every tear. There's no more struggle, no more of these difficulties and these trials and these afflictions. He's calling us to a better home, a better place, even as so very good this world really is, not just was, but because of man messing everything up continually, we do have an opportunity to have something even greater. But we have to get through this life relying upon God first and foremost. Richard, go ahead.
I think we need to look at the book of Job, because really Job is the one, he's the first one that we know of who says, why does God allow suffering? Satan appeared before Job, or before the Lord, twice. And the Lord, was very happy about Job and the life he was living. And of course, Satan says, well, that's because you built a hedge around him. Let me afflict him a little bit. Mm-hmm. And twice he was allowed to do that. He had to spare his life. But everything else, was pretty much open game. And so Job sets out, and now he's extremely depressed. His wife is encouraging him to curse God and die. He has these three friends, if you want to call them friends. And basically they're telling him, you're suffering because you've sinned. And Job's like, well, I don't know what I did wrong, and so the main part of the book, it's these three friends who are not speaking right about God, but are basically rebuking Job. And then finally, at the end of the book, the Lord appears before Job in a whirlwind, and he really answers the question that we're looking for today. And he said, and this is what he says. He goes, is the clay going to tell the potter what he's making? And when Josh said that we walk by faith and not by sight, that's part of it. The Lord is creating something, and sometimes he uses these trials that come upon us in creating what he wants to make. Now, he's God, and we are not to question what he's making, but we have to understand there's enough scriptures that provide us insight to the fact that he can use evil for good. And if we're faithful to God, we have to have faith in the fact that the Lord is going to do that very thing. Now, there's a couple of passages I want to bring to mind that when this happens to a Christian, that they can be prepared for. And number one, when you suffer righteously, notice what is said in Philippians 1:29 and 30. He says, it's been granted to you that for the sake of Christ, you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake. Think about that. And we have, where's that other passage I was thinking about here? Hang on just a second. We're talking Philippians chapter 3 and verse 10. It says, I want to know the Messiah, Paul said, that what his resurrection power is like, and what it means to share in his sufferings by becoming like him in his death. And so now what he's talking about is having fellowship in the sufferings of Christ. And so many times, and I am the top whiner of all time. Nobody's worse whiner than me. But what we have to understand is when these trials come, we don't whine about it. We shouldn't whine about it. We should be, if we're suffering for righteousness' sake, especially, we should be thankful, because the Lord has enabled us to have fellowship in the sufferings of Christ. We are walking in his steps. And so we shouldn't be sorrowful when those things happen. It is an opportunity to be Christ-like. And so that's whom we look for. We get so upset. Man does. And I guess I should say me. Everything in the world can be perfect in my life. But you know what? If I get a hangnail, I'm going to focus on that hangnail and say, man, why did this happen to me? This little bitty thing, it's causing me pain. Even though everything else is perfect, we focus on the negative. That's the way we are. And that's most unfortunate. We need to look to God and be thankful for all our blessings, understanding that, there's going to be suffering in this life. In some cases, it's going to happen to us to test us, to see if we'll be faithful, as we've seen what happened to Job, in 1 Peter 4:12 and 13. It says, beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial which comes upon you to test you. And so we understand there are times that we're going to be tried. Abraham was one that when he was tested, it was shown what passage is that? One of you guys know that, don't you? Where Abraham was tested. Trying to remember that off the top of my head. Hebrews 11:17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, when whom he had received you would have thought that was a horrible ordeal that had come upon him to have to offer up Isaac, but he was being tested. And so there are occasions, when we're going to suffer, because the Lord's going to see, how are you going to react to this? Are you going to be faithful? Are you going to choose good over evil? And remember, that's the whole essence of life right there. What are you going to choose? You know, I think of Jesus when he was tempted in the wilderness. You know, the devil, he doesn't care. He doesn't come around when things are convenient. He waits when it's very inconvenient. And here, our Lord and Savior, you know, he was 40 days and 40 nights without food. He was tired. He was beat up. And that's when the devil came. And when we are living this life, we have to understand we're going to be tested many times, not when it's convenient, but when we're going through these trials. And the Lord is watching and he is waiting to see what we're going to choose. Are we going to choose that which is good or that which is evil? Because, my friends, that is the essence of life. That's what you're going to be judged on. What did you choose?
Amen. It is, and it is definitely, it is a choice. That's something that we need to understand. We have an active role and a part to play. 2 Peter chapter 1, beginning in verse 5, add to your faith knowledge, virtue, to your virtue knowledge, to your knowledge, self-control, to your self-control, patience, to your patience, godliness, to your godliness, brotherly kindness, to your brotherly kindness, add love. Do these things. Right? It doesn't say when the circumstances are good. It doesn't say when everything's going right. Right? This is something that we need to be doing, working constantly at, in spite of circumstances and situations and struggles and trials and afflictions and difficulties, you know, and rather than focusing upon those things, you know, all that is just trying to take our focus away from God, but focus on him. There is this art, a Japanese art form called kintsugi, and it is where they take a broken piece of pottery and they put it back together with titanium or gold or silver and accentuates all of those cracks and everything. And what is put back together is more valuable than the piece before it was even broken. And this is God putting us back together, binding us by the blood of Christ, fixing all of those things that were wrong as we rely upon him. And as Jesus said in Matthew chapter 11, come unto me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And so, you know, why would he say that if he didn't understand that there are struggles and difficulties? Because he does understand. He does know. He's been through so many things when he was in the flesh. He understands, you know, the things that we go through. And so we should turn to him and we should rely upon him for those things. Josh, you got some last thoughts for us today?
Yeah, you mentioned James 2, or I'm sorry, James 1, verse 2 and 3 and 4, where he talks about counting it all joy when you fall into various trials. That's not that we're, oh, yay, I get to suffer. But we ought to ask ourselves, how can I use this to grow? How can I use this to, as Peter says in 1 Peter 1, to be tested by fire, that gold that has been, thrown into the fire to be purified. How can I use this to purify me, to deepen my faith, to strengthen me, to build my hope in God? Just focus on the eternal, and good things will happen. Good results will come from the sufferings that you endure.
Yeah, absolutely. Richard, last thoughts?
Yeah, I do want to say one thing to Christians who go through suffering. Remember this, and this is important. Jesus made it very clear. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul, he relays this in verse 13. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man, and God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond what your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. And one of the best examples that I know of that is when the Lord was leading the Israelites out of Egypt. They could have taken a straight shot by the way of the Philistines, but the Lord said no. He says, I'm not going, in verse 17, in Exodus 13, I'm not going by that route, even though that's near. He says, because the people may change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. In other words, he was afraid that they might choose wrong. And then in verse 18, it says God led the people around by the way of the wilderness and the Red Sea. And so they went that way. And so at that particular moment, we see that the Lord was in charge of their spiritual development. He was not allowing them to be tempted more than they were able to bear. But later on, when he sent the 12 spies into the promised land to search out the land, they were expected to go in and conquer the Philistines. And the Lord, he that was now before them. So this is a good passage to show how the Lord is watching over us. And even though you may be going through a trial as a Christian, don't let that consume you. The Lord thinks you can do it. And if the Lord thinks you can do it, then we need to think we can do it and allow the good that will come. Let the potter make what he's creating from the clay.
Yeah, but and of course it can only be done if we abide in Him, and His Word abides in us. Folks, we appreciate everybody tuning in, listening to Berean Spirits, whether it is on the podcast or whether you catch us live here on YouTube and Facebook and all the other social medias that we are on. If you want to email us with thoughts, questions, comments, you can do so, bereanspirits@gmail.com. We'll be happy to address those as well. We appreciate everybody tunes in and listens. Until next time, remember to search the scriptures with Berean Spirits.
Well, folks, that's all for today. Don't worry. Lord willing, the guys will be back next week for another Bible study on Berean Spirits. Until then, let the guys hear from you. Drop them some email at bereanspirits@gmail.com. They'd love to hear from you. Until next time, let's keep studying that Bible.